Okay, good morning, everyone. We are learning Lila Nishmas Mindel Mariam Bas Kalman Reuven Hanashama Shem Aliyah. We are in Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis by the Mishnah, top of the Amud Mishnah over there, and we are talking about saving things from a fire. We're going to discuss why a person cannot save more, but the Mishnah is going to tell us that a person is only allowed to save a limited amount of food from their home. If their home is, heaven forbid, on fire on Shabbos, they're only allowed to save a limited amount. So the Mishnah says, Matzila Mezon Shalosh Seudos. On Shabbos, you're allowed to save food for 3 meals. Hara'ui la'adam la'adam. Food fit for a person is allowed to be saved for a person. In other words, if you're saving food, it has to be food that's obviously fit for a person. You can't save food that's not fit for a person. Hara'ui levehema. You're allowed to fit that's fit for an animal. You save for an animal. The Mishnah over here is telling us that you're allowed to save food for animals as well. We're about to see. Okay, let's read on, and then we'll come back to the animal piece. Ketza, the Mishnah says how much food is allowed to be saved. So nafla dleika b'leilei Shabbos. If fire breaks out Friday night before the person eats their Friday night meal, matzila mizon shalosh seudos. A person's allowed to save the food for 3 meals. Okay, since you have 3 meals that you must eat over Shabbos, Friday night, Shabbos day, and Shabbos afternoon, or Shabbos, shalosh seudos, then you're allowed to save 3 meals. B'shachris, if the fire breaks out in the morning, matzila mizon shtei seudos. You save the food for 2 meals. Mibincha, if it's in the afternoon, after your afternoon meal, mizon suda achas, you save for only 1 meal. However, Rav Yossi Omer la'olam matzil mizon shalosh seudos. You're always allowed to save food for 3 meals. When our sages permitted a person to save food and take the food out of their house, they did not distinguish between when it was in the day. Rav Yossi says you're always allowed to save 3 meals. Now, interestingly, the Mishnah seems to indicate that the same amount of meals you're allowed to save for people, you're allowed to save for an animal. Now, animals don't necessarily eat breakfast, lunch, and supper, right? So I don't know if they had a fish, but you feed them like in the morning. I don't know. Do you always have like breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Like they don't have the same meal schedule as people. But there is a very important halacha, and that is that it is forbidden for a person to eat before feeding their animal. And therefore, for that reason, some Rishonim understand that Tiferes Yisrael and others understand that no, you must save 3 meals. Whatever amount of meals you're saving per person, you must save the same amount of meals. It's true. The animal may not be, quote unquote, as hungry as the person. Maybe they're only going to have typically a big breakfast, but you have to save enough food that you're able to theoretically serve them before each meal, because there is halacha, again, sometimes not so well known, that it is forbidden for us to eat before ensuring that our animal is fed. And theoretically, they could be hungry in the afternoon. You have to go ahead and feed them before you have lunch. They might be hungry in the evening, even though it's not their typical meal, but you have to make sure, check in with their animal to make sure that they have food before you eat your food. We have to take care of others before we take care of ourselves. Okay, says the Gemara, Michti, Beter Katarach. What's going on over here? Why are you only allowed to say, we're talking about taking food not into a mavoi, like we saw in the Mishnah before at the Sefer Torah. Here we're talking about taking the food and bringing it into a courtyard, and a courtyard is a regular shusar yachid, right? The courtyard, now we're no longer talking about Kim, we're talking about Elrei, right? So we're no longer talking about the mavoi, the space in between. We're talking about just the courtyard, and presumably the courtyard was connected, meaning they made an erev chatzeros, which means that they shared, food together and making it all like a private domain. Why can't you take more food? Not tzvei. Why can't a person take more food? Says the Gemara, Amarav mitachshad ambahul amamono, because a person is in turmoil over the loss of their property. Isharas le asi lechabuy. If you permit a person to start taking out more stuff from their house, we're concerned that they're going to extinguish the fire because they're going to be focusing on it, and therefore we say you take the bare minimum, you take what you need for that Shabbos, and that is it. Amar le Abaye. Abaye says, wait a second. If that is the reason, Elahadatani, that we learned in the Brisa. If you're in the arts, go on the next page. We learned in the Brisa the following: Nishbralo chavis barosh gago. If a person has a barrel of wine that breaks on one's rooftop, now a barrel of wine is packed with wine. Right? A barrel of wine, we're talking about a huge keg of wine, and they're starting to lose wine on Shabbos. So maybe kli uminiach tachteha. You're allowed to bring a vessel and place it in the courtyard below in order to save the wine. Right? Let's say, imagine a person has a barrel of wine up on their rooftop. It was a storage place, and it broke. And so now it starts pouring off the roof and falling into the courtyard. You're allowed to take a big bathtub or whatever and start catching the wine. Uvilvad, however, with a limitation. Shlo yavi kli acher v'yiklot. You're not allowed to take, you're only allowed to use one vessel. You can't go and bring a second vessel now and catch the wine in midair as it falls from the roof. Or in addition, kli acher v'tzaref, or another vessel and hold it level to the roof to collect the wine. In other words, you're only allowed to use one vessel to catch the falling wine. You're not allowed to use 2 vessels. The Gemara asks, Hasa mai gzer ika. Bai asks, I don't understand. In the case, you're telling me the whole reason you can't take more by the fire is you might put the fire out. But you see, there's this general theme of limitations on saving things in scenarios where there's no concern of kiboy, of a biblical prohibition of extinguishing the fire. Over here we're talking about a barrel that breaks, and also you have these limitations. These limitations kind of having to do with the fire, so it must be there's something else going on. The Gemara says no, it's the same thing. Hachinami gezer shemayavi kli derech rishus harabim. The concern here also is because a person is going to be concerned about their wine. A barrel of wine, you just lost a lot of money. So in a person's haste, and a person being overwhelmed by the loss, they might go ahead and bring a vessel through the public domain refrain and also be in violation of a biblical prohibition. So we have these limitations on saving things, even though theoretically it could be done in a way that's totally valid. But the reason there are limitations is to ensure that a person is not in violation, to not go ahead and violate a biblical prohibition. Yes?
The wine barrel, I would understand it. I was thinking before we got to it that it makes sense that would be something that there would be a significant financial loss of that. There's no way to get it back or whatever. But in terms of the food or other, you shouldn't be able to take more than you need for that Shabbos because you're preparing for afterwards. That should be one of the issues that they bring up.
Okay, but so for that, it would seem good. It's a great question. It would seem that the issue, the reason that it's not brought up is that would be an Isser D'Rabbanan, and for that alone, we will not do it. It was only because of a decree of maybe going and violating Isser D'Oraisa, that's when they're going to make a limitation. In other words, it seems like, to your point, it seems like had it not been for the Isser D'Oraisa, would say, okay, you could go and violate this rabbinic prohibition because of the great financial loss, but for the biblical prohibition of putting out the fire, that far we're not going to go. Good. Okay, Gufa. Let's go back to that brayso. Nishbrelo chavis barosh gago. So now we're going to analyze. Whenever I say Gufa, that means we're going back and analyzing the brayso that was just quoted. So we're going like on a tangent from the last brayso that was quoted. Nishbrelo chavis barosh gago. Right. So the brayso said if a barrel breaks on top of one's rooftop, maybe kli umaniach tachta, you're allowed to bring one vessel and place it on the floor to catch the wine. As long as you don't bring an additional vessel, kli acher vitzara, to catch the wine in midair, or kli acher vitzara for another vessel and hold it level to the roof. Fine. However, nizdamilo orchin. Let's say a person has guests, okay? So he has guests, now he has to serve more wine. Maybe kli acher v'kolet, you now have permission to bring another vessel, kli acher mitzaref, or another vessel and bring another vessel and catch in the air, or bring another vessel and hold it level to the roof, okay? V'lo yiklod v'achkach yasmin. What you're not allowed to do is catch the wine and then go and invite guests. Al yasmin v'achkach yiklod. But if you invite a guest before, then you're allowed to catch it. We can't do a shtick. You can't do a subterfuge. In other words, you can't go ahead and say, oh my gosh, my bottle of wine is breaking. Who wants to come to my house for some wine, right? And then you invite your whole neighborhood. Now I have guests. I'm allowed to go and bring more vessels. That I can't do. I can't do shtick. If I really had guests coming, then there's more of an allowance for me to save more wine, right? Then I'm allowed to bring more vessels. Then we don't have that decree. But if I wasn't having guests, I'm not allowed to do so, okay?
So you can't invite them in the false pretense that they're going to be guests of yours and then collect more, and then they don't actually give it to them.
Well, you can invite them by in a scenario where you didn't really plan on inviting them. You're only inviting them to save the wine.
Right, and then they don't. Right.
Or even if they do come, that's still a shtick.
You could just say, okay, everybody come and sell.
No, but that's still a shtick. I believe that would still be harama. Harama would be, you're saying if they ultimately come, that's not harama. I think harama is inviting guests. Any scenario you're going to invite guests where you weren't really planning on inviting guests, that would seem to be the issue. It's only if you really invite a guest beforehand, then you'd be allowed to do this. If you go ahead and invite guests afterwards.
You could only be able to, I guess, feeds a lot, right? There's a lot of people that could drink from this. So you
don't have to invite, so the Mishnah does not distinguish, the Brisa does not distinguish between how many guests. If you just had 5 guests, okay, so you're allowed to bring one, right? Meaning keep in mind, we see this in another place in Halacha, where a person does not have to, let's say on Yom Tov, you're only allowed to cook enough you're not allowed to cook for after Yom Tov, but you don't have to cook just the minuscule amount, right? If you have guests, you don't want to be serving, if you want to serve, you want to serve a tray of kugel. Only people are going to eat 5 pieces of kugel, so what? You want to serve a whole thing. So with the wine as well, once you have guests, carte blanche, you're allowed to go ahead and save as much wine as you want, right? You don't have to worry about it, okay? It's nice, you can bring a barrel out. Okay, says Rav Yossi, Mishum Rav Yossi Bar Yehuda Amru Marimin, he says, no, you are allowed to make a shtick. In other words, he says, you are allowed to do this. If your barrel is breaking, your barrel broke, and now you're stuck, you're allowed to go ahead and make an announcement, hey, anyone who wants wine, I need guests, anyone come to my house for guests, even though he wasn't really planning on inviting them, he's allowed to do so. So the Gemara now tries to connect this debate between Rav Yossi Bar Yehuda, who says you're allowed to make a shtick, and the Tanna Kama says you're not allowed to make a shtick, with another Machlokes Lema Plukta to Rav Eliezer, Rav Yeshua Kamifli. Maybe these two, Rav Yossi Bar Yehuda and the Tanna Kama, are aligned with the views of Rav Eliezer and Rav Yeshua. What are we referring to? The time we taught on the Brisa. Oso ves beno shenaflu lebar. Let's say an animal and its offspring fell into a pit on Yom Tov. So a couple of halachos. First of all, on Yom Tov, you're allowed to slaughter an animal to eat it. Right? We spoke about that earlier. Right? Slaughtering an animal is one of the things you do for food. You're allowed to do anything for ochel nefesh, for food on Yom Tov. What you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov is slaughter a parent and a child animal on the same day. You can't slaughter the parent and the child on the same day. That's halacha. There's a limitation. Some understand that it's meant to represent the fact that although we engage and we partake from the animal kingdom, we have to have limitations. We don't want to, so to speak, wipe out the entire species. So taking a mother and a child in the same moment, in the same day, is a representation of that. It's saying we have a certain, we engage, we take, but we do so with a certain level of apprehension and caution, and therefore it's aser oso vespano is an isser doraisa. You're not allowed to slaughter a mother and its kid on the same day. So let's say you have two animals that fell into a pit on Yom Tov, the mother and the child. So now one of them is by definition muksa, because you can't. The only reason you're allowed to touch the animals is if you're going to slaughter it. But I can't slaughter both of them on Yom Tov, and now they're both stuck down in the pit. So what am I allowed to do? Rabbi Eliezer Omer, malas arishon amanas shochto. Okay, a person is allowed to raise the first animal in order to slaughter it, and then he has to slaughter it. Vasheni osala parnasam komo b'shvil shelo yamos. And the second one, you're allowed to feed it. Okay, even though it's muksa, you're allowed to feed it. There's not a problem. You're allowed to feed it to ensure that it doesn't die. But you're not allowed to pull it out of the pit because it's muksa, because only one of them can be slaughtered. So the first one you take out, you slaughter it. The second one you have to leave there. Rabbi Yeshua says no. Malanis arishon almas l'shofto. Ve'ena shofto. Take the first one out in order to slaughter it, and don't slaughter it. Umar malas l'sheni. Then say, oh, you know what? I take the first one. I say, you know what? I don't like the first one. I'm going to take the second one. I really want the second one now. And you take the second one out, right? So it's a shtick, right? And then you could slaughter ratzas shochet. Then you could decide which one you want to slaughter. So it would seem that Rabbi Yeshua, who said you're allowed to do the shtick, is going like the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, who says you're allowed to invite guests after the bottle breaks, and Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you're not allowed to do the shtick, would seem to go like the Tanna Kama. The Gemara says no. There's no real. Maybe they're not really connected. But Mimai, who says that they really are connected? Dilma ad kan lokam Rabbi Eliezer hasam de efsher b'parnasa. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer ruled stringently there in the case of the animals, because you're able to ensure the animal doesn't die. There's not a complete loss. Granted, the animal is going to be stuck there, and granted, it's possible it's going to die in that pit, but you'll be feeding it, and hopefully it'll survive. But in the case of the wine spilling, maybe since there's no way of saving the wine, maybe he'll be more lenient, and maybe he would allow a little bit of a shtick. In other words, the two cases are not identical. In the case of the two animals falling in, it's possible to save the second animal by feeding it. Whereas in the case of the wine is spilling, maybe he'll be more lenient because there's no way of saving all the wine. And maybe Rabbi Yeshua was lenient about pulling both animals out because there's an additional feature, which is additional mitigating factor, and that is that the animal is suffering by being there. Maybe that's why he's lenient. But in the case of spilling wine, you may be upset, but there's no animal suffering, and therefore maybe he would not be lenient there. But bottom line is the two cases are not identical. Okay, Tana Rabbanan. Now we go further in the discussion about saving food. Hitzel pas nakia ematzil pasadra. If a person saved bread of fine flour, let's say you save 3 rolls of good bread, you're not allowed to go ahead and then save bread of inferior flour. In other words, if you save food for 3 meals of good high-end food, you can't go ahead and say, okay, now I'm going to save 3 more meals of bad food. Of course not. But the flip side is what we want to say. Pasadra, matzil pasnikiyav. Let's say a person goes ahead on Shabbos, and there's this fire, right? And they go ahead and they save 3, quasi-moldy rolls, right? I don't know, whatever, food which is not so good. And then they say, oh, you know what, I'm going to go back and save 3 really good home-baked rolls, right? I want to save some really good rolls. I'm allowed to do that because there I could still say, maybe on Shabbos, I don't want to have the lousy ones, I want to have the good ones. So if I save the inferior ones, I'm allowed to then go ahead and save the better ones, okay? Umatzilim Yom Kippur on the Shabbos, on Yom Kippur, I'm allowed to save for Shabbos. Meaning if Yom Kippur fell out on Friday, I'm allowed to save food for Shabbos, right? Because I have no way of shopping for food or baking any food on Yom Kippur for Shabbos, and therefore, even though today's Yom Kippur, I'm allowed to go ahead and save for Shabbos, okay? Avalomi Shabbos Yom Kippurim. But on Shabbos, I can't save for Yom Kippur, okay? Because and certainly I can't save from Shabbos to Yom Tov, right? Because Lo Mishabbos Yom Kippurim, I can't save on Shabbos to Yom Kippur, because if I do so, then what's going to happen? If I save from Yom Kippur, Shabbos to Yom Kippur, when am I allowed to eat on Yom Kippur? Matzah Yom Kippur. Matzah Yom Kippur, I'm allowed to cook. So by the time I need food, I'm going to be allowed to cook. And therefore, if a fire breaks out on Shabbos, I'm not allowed to save from Shabbos to Matzah Yom Kippur, because once Yom Kippur is over, granted, it'll take a few extra minutes, but I'm able to cook food at that point. And for sure, I'm not allowed to cook I'm not allowed to save on Shabbos for Yom Tov, because on Yom Tov I'm allowed to cook. On Shabbos I'm not allowed to save for the next Shabbos, because the next Shabbos, of course, there's 6 days in between, and I could cook at that time. Okay? So far so good. Tanar Banan. We learned in the Brisa. Shachach pas b'taner. A person forgets bread in an oven. V'kidesh alav hayom, and it became Shabbos. Now we're not talking about our ovens where you just put something on a tray. We're talking about an oven back in the day where the food was placed on the walls. You still have some restaurants in Israel that do this. They place, and we've spoken on this type of oven before. You place the bread on the walls of the oven. Now in our ovens, it's very simple. You just open the oven and take the bread out. That's what you should do. If you left bread in the oven on Shabbos, that's fine. You open the oven, take all the bread out, totally fine. But if you left bread in an oven of an ancient oven, okay, and the ancient world, and there's a unique way. It's like an art, like a skill set to take the food off the walls, and that is something which is seen as a not full-fledged malach as we're about to see, but still something asur. So what are you allowed to do if you left bread? Let's say you left a whole thing of bread, one of these huge baker ovens, and you're a baker, and you left a whole stack of 100 rolls of bread in one of these ovens. Matzil mezon shalosh seudos. You're only allowed to take 3 meals worth off. That's all you're allowed to do. And then you tell other people, listen, you want some bread? Great. Come to my house, come to my oven, and take as much bread as you want. When you remove it, you can't use the baker's paddle, which is the normal fashion. You have to use a knife to take it off. Why? Because using a baker's paddle in these types of ovens, that is, as we're about to see, what we're about to see with the issues. Anything want to ask about a ton of baby Shmuel? Yeah?
Is it different than the wine case? With the wine case, you're doing it all for yourself, but here you're letting other people take it.
Over,
okay?
Yeah, over there, other people are doing it. That's totally fine.
Right.
That's totally fine.
It's not for your benefit.
Correct. They're taking exactly. If other people come and bring a bottle of wine to get their own wine, that's fine, right? You can't do work. That's the Torah says. Blowing a shofar, okay, or the removal of bread from an oven. Those are not labors; those are arts. So what is Rabbi Shmuel? What is Rabbi Shmuel teaching us? What he's teaching us is that Chazal went ahead and included certain activities which are labor-like in rabbinic prohibitions, but things which are not labor-like, they're just seen as an art, those are not included. And therefore he's saying that we're just going to focus on the one of taking the bread off with the paddle, that's not a labor at all. There's no way Chazal came along and made any decrees about that, and therefore the Gemara is asking, it's not a malacha at all. Shouldn't even be rabbinically prohibited. So Gemara says the reason has to still be done in an unusual manner, because we still want to deviate as much as we could possibly deviate, because it still is. The Mefarshim explain that although it's not even malacha-esque, it is not similar in any way to a malacha. At the end of the day, it's uvda dechol. This is something you do during the weekday. You don't take off bread from an oven on Shabbos, and therefore it's uvda dechol. It's something which is seen as a weekday activity, and therefore you should still deviate. And that's why you use a knife. You don't take it off with a paddle. Okay, now we're going to learn some important halachos about preparing for Shabbos and seudos that we're supposed to have on Shabbos. A person must wake up early on Friday to get ready for Shabbos. It says they prepared la'alter. Okay, the implication is that they prepared immediately. They wake up in the morning and they start preparing for Shabbos. Some of us prepare for Shabbos to the last minute. Okay, that's so sometimes we're forced to. But ideally, my grandparents, I don't know, I'd come home from in the morning at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they'd be sitting there in the Shabbos clothes. Their house would be all ready for Shabbos. I don't know what time they woke up, but that's what you're supposed to do. That's what you're really supposed to do. You're supposed to wake up and get ready for Shabbos first thing. There's even a Pri Megadim which says that although you're not allowed to go shopping, you're not supposed to be going shopping before you daven. There is a discussion about, since getting ready for Shabbos is tzorchei mitzvah, and because of this pasuk, there is discussion about the fact that you might be allowed to go ahead and shop for Shabbos before davening because of this pasuk. Okay, so normally we don't do you don't go on Amazon before Shabbos, but before Shacharis, but here you would. Okay, Amar Rabba Abba, b'Shabbos chayv adam levtzo al shtei kikaros. The person has obligated to break bread over 2 loaves. D'chsiv lechem mishnah. The pasuk says about the man, it was a double portion. Amar Rashi chazina le Rav Kana naka tarti vatzachada. He would hold 2 loaves, but he'd only cut 1. Amar, he says laktu ksiv. It says that they gathered, it doesn't say that they broke. So the Tanakhama seems to be saying that you actually cut both loaves, and there were some, the Maharshal and others, would go ahead and cut both loaves. Our minhag is to hold both loaves, but right, when you make hamotzi, it's more to hold them up as well when you say hamotzi, but only, you have to, you're supposed to lift them up, but you only have to cut 1 loaf of bread. You could cut the second one, but you only have to cut 1 bread. Rav Zera babatza akule sherusa, Rav Zera would break a very large piece. Amalei Ravina Ravashi, v'amechse Rav Tanusa. He appears like a gluttonous individual by having a huge piece of bread. Since most of the week, he does not take big pieces of bread. He takes a small piece of bread, which is seen as the polite thing to do. Therefore, since that's the case, a person therefore is not seen like a glutton if on Shabbos they take a large piece of bread, and that is the minhag. You're supposed to cut very generous pieces of bread. Okay, Ravami Ravasi ki mikla lahu rifta de ruva. Rav Amir Vasi, when the bread of Erev Chatzeres happened to be deposited with them. What that means is that if you're part of a Chatzer, again, El Rei, not Kim, you're an El Rei, and you have a bunch of different people who are part of your Chatzer, so what would happen happen is one person would collect loaves of bread, and every week in their time it would stay at a different person's house, and that person would be able to eat the bread on that Shabbos. So that person, so Rav Ami and Rav Asi, they would go ahead and make hamotzi on the bread of Erev Chatzeros. Why? Shari Ulave, they would begin their meal with it, meaning they would say hamotzi on it. Why? Amri hovis avid beichad mitzvah, since one mitzvah was performed with it, i.e. the mitzvah of Erev Chatzeros, lis avid ba mitzvah chrina, we are going to do another mitzvah. Okay, let's just start the next section. Keitza nafla dleika, the Mishnah said, if a fire broke out, you're allowed to stay for 3 meals. Tanar Rabbanan, we have a machlokus about how many meals the person obligated to eat on Shabbos. Kama sudos chayav adam nachal b'Shabbos, how many meals the person obligated to eat on Shabbos? Shalosh. Tanakama says 3. Rav Chidka Amar Arba. Rav Chidka says 4. The Gemara is going to okay, Amar Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan says Shnei Mikra Chadash. They both learn from the same pasuk. V'yomer Moshe Chlu Hayom Ki Shabbos Hayom Lashem Hayom L'Simsu Basada. Right? Moshe, in talking about the man, used the word today 3 times. Rav Chidka Savar Hani Tlasa Hayom Levar Me'ortza. Rav Chidka says these instructions of Moshe about the man were given on Shabbos morning. So that means they already had a meal the night before. So if it says 3 hayoms, 3 days, 3 times day, a meal 3 times, that means there's 3 meals in addition to the Friday night meal. Rabbanan Savri V'Hadei De'orta, it's inclusive of the evening meal, and therefore they say there's only 3, and that is the way we pass them, that there is an obligation to have 3 meals on Shabbos. We're going to go into a discussion about trying to prove this from our Mishnayos, but the bottom line is that Halach L'Mais is that there's a full-fledged obligation to have 3 meals, both for men and women. There's no distinction to have 3 meals every Shabbos. We'll talk about some possible exceptions, God willing, in the days to come. Have a great day.